The clock above the counter ticked softly, its steady rhythm the only sound breaking the quiet hum of the diner. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily under the dim streetlights, coating the empty road in a thin layer of white. It was one of those nights that seemed to stretch forever, cold, lonely, and heavy with silence. Inside, the warmth of the small diner glowed against the frost, the faint scent of coffee and freshly fried eggs lingering in the air. At a corner booth near the window, a man sat hunched over his plate. His jacket, once a deep navy blue, was faded and worn from long hours of labor. His hands, strong, cracked, and stained with the kind of dirt that never fully washed away, moved slowly as he ate. He wasn't in a rush. In fact, this was his only real meal of the day. He'd spent 12 hours fixing engines at the auto shop, listening to the endless clanging of metal and the sharp hiss of steam. Now, for a brief moment, he allowed himself to rest. The waitress had refilled his coffee twice, and each time he'd nodded gratefully but said little. He was a man of few words, the kind who had learned to find comfort in quiet moments. His eyes, however, carried a tired kindness, the kind of look that came from having seen both the best and worst sides of people. Across the diner, in a booth tucked against the far wall, a woman sat with her little girl. Their coats were thin, not meant for weather like this. The woman's face was pale under the flickering light, and strands of damp hair clung to her forehead. In front of her sat a single chipped cup of coffee, long gone cold. She held it anyway, just to keep her hands warm. The little girl, no more than 6 or 7, sat close beside her mother. Her small feet barely touched the floor, and her eyes, large and full of quiet curiosity, were fixed on the man's plate across the room. She watched the way he cut into his food, how steam rose from each bite, how his fork glimmered in the light. Her lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment she swallowed hard, as if trying to imagine what it would taste like. Her mother noticed. She gently touched the girl's hand. "Don't stare, sweetheart," she whispered, forcing a small smile. "People might think it's rude." The girl nodded but didn't look away. There was something in her eyes, an innocent longing that couldn't be hidden by good manners. The man didn't notice at first. He was lost in thought, his mind drifting between the day's exhaustion and the comfort of warm food. But after a while, that faint pull of attention, the feeling of being watched, made him glance up. And that's when he saw her. The little girl quickly lowered her gaze, pretending to trace circles on the table with her finger. Her mother's face flushed with embarrassment. She whispered something softly, maybe an apology meant for no one to hear. But the man had already seen enough. Something in that small, fleeting exchange tugged at him. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He had known that kind of hunger before, the kind that wasn't just in your stomach but deep in your bones. The kind that made the smell of food feel like a memory you couldn't quite touch. He looked at his plate again. Half of it was still untouched, a generous serving of pancakes, eggs, and a slice of toast. It suddenly looked different to him, not like food, but like something undeserved, something that someone else might need more. The mother turned her head slightly, checking the clock on the wall. Her expression tightened. She reached into her worn purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills. It wasn't much, barely enough for the single coffee they'd ordered. The waitress, who had seen them come in, had already guessed they wouldn't be staying long. Outside, the wind howled softly, pushing against the diner windows. The girl shivered and tucked her hands into her sleeves. The man sipped his coffee slowly, pretending not to watch, but his eyes lingered. He noticed the small rip in the girl's coat sleeve, the way her mother rubbed her shoulders to keep her warm. He noticed, too, that the coffee had gone untouched for a long time. The air felt heavier somehow, filled with unspoken things. He wanted to do something, but didn't know what. There was a line between kindness and intrusion, and he wasn't sure which side he'd be crossing. So he stayed still for now, silent and watchful, as the warmth of the diner wrapped around all three of them like a fragile thread. 3 strangers bound by hunger, exhaustion, and something quietly human. And in that dim golden light, with snow pressing against the glass, the little girl's eyes rose once more, hesitant, hopeful, and impossibly innocent. just as he lifted his fork again. This time, he didn't look away. The diner's clock struck 9, its steady ticking echoing softly through the nearly empty room. Outside, the snow had thickened, blanketing the street in white silence. The neon sign flickered faintly against the window, its red glow reflecting on the glass like a heartbeat. Inside, the warmth was gentle, but a different kind of chill had settled at the corner booth, the kind that came from worry. The woman checked her purse again, her fingers trembling slightly. She counted the small collection of coins and crumpled bills for the third time, her face tight with quiet despair. It wasn't enough, not even close. She tried to mask it from her daughter, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The little girl, still sitting upright, was tracing invisible shapes on the table with her small finger. Every now and then her gaze drifted to the man again. He was still there, his head slightly bowed, his coffee cup half empty. The soft hum of the overhead light buzzed faintly, filling the silence between them. The mother sighed softly, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of months, maybe years of trying. She leaned down toward her daughter and whispered, "Come on, baby, let's go." The girl looked up, her big brown eyes uncertain. "But Mama, aren't you gonna eat?" The woman smiled gently, brushing her daughter's hair away from her face. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow." The girl nodded obediently, though her small stomach growled audibly in the quiet room. She reached for her mother's hand, clutching it tightly as they stood. The woman placed the few coins she had on the table beside the cold coffee cup, an unspoken apology to the waitress, and turned toward the door. The man had been pretending not to watch, but every movement caught his eye, the nervous way the woman folded her scarf, the way she kept her head low, and the way the little girl's shoulders slumped as if the world already felt heavy on them. He saw them walking slowly toward the exit, their steps hesitant, almost apologetic. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He set down his fork, his plate half full. His hand tightened slightly on the handle of his coffee mug, and then he looked up. "Wait." The single word broke through the quiet like the softest thunder. The woman froze mid-step. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Her daughter looked up at her, confused, then back at the man who had spoken. He was standing now, his tall frame silhouetted against the warm diner lights. His voice had been gentle, but it carried a firmness that made it impossible to ignore. He didn't move closer yet. He just stood there, one hand resting on the back of his chair, eyes fixed on them. The woman started, her voice faltering. "I'm sorry. We were just leaving." The man shook his head lightly. "You forgot something." Her brows furrowed. "What?" He nodded toward the table. "A meal." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and a faint flush of embarrassment crept into her cheeks. "No, we're fine," she said quickly, her tone defensive but shaky. We're not hungry." The man didn't respond right away. He glanced at the little girl, her cheeks pink from the cold, her lips pressed together to hide her disappointment. Her eyes were fixed on the plate he'd left behind, the one still half full of food. He sighed softly, then smiled, not a forced or pitying smile, but one that felt human, warm, and real. "You sure about that?" he asked. The mother looked away, ashamed. Her hands tightened around her daughter's shoulders as if to protect her from the moment. "Please," she whispered, "we can't accept charity." He nodded slowly. "It's not charity," he said, "it's dinner." For a long moment no one spoke. The waitress glanced up from behind the counter, watching silently but not interfering. She had seen scenes like this before, people hiding their pride behind politeness, and kindness waiting quietly for permission to step in. The woman hesitated, torn between dignity and desperation. Her daughter tugged at her coat gently. "Mama," the little girl whispered, "can we stay? Just a little?" The woman looked down into those eyes, wide, innocent, and hungry, and her heart broke a little more. The man took a slow step forward. "Please," he said softly, "sit down. I was just about to order dessert anyway. It'd be wrong not to share, right?" The woman opened her mouth, ready to refuse again, but the warmth in his voice melted her resistance. It wasn't condescending or pitying, it was kind, the kind of kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. She looked back at the empty booth they'd just left, then at her daughter, who was already smiling shyly at the man. Finally, she exhaled. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded once, a small smile curving his lips. "Good," he said, motioning to the booth. "I'll call the waitress." As they sat back down, the tension in the air began to ease. The mother still looked uncertain, her fingers nervously twisting the napkin. But the little girl's face had brightened, her eyes fixed hopefully on the menu, as if a dream had suddenly come true. The man returned to his seat, quietly signaling to the waitress. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside that small diner, something else was beginning to stir, a quiet act of compassion that would soon change the night for all three of them. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and tired hands, noticed the man's quiet gesture and gave a knowing nod. She'd been in this business long enough to recognize the difference between pity and genuine kindness, and what she saw in his eyes tonight was something rare. She disappeared into the kitchen without a word, already preparing what she knew he'd ask for. The man sat back down, his chair creaking slightly. He watched as the mother and her little girl settled into the booth again. The child's face glowed faintly in the warm diner light, her eyes darting from the man to the menu and back again, as if afraid the moment might vanish if she blinked too long. The mother still looked tense, her hands wrapped tightly around the napkin. She spoke softly, almost whispering, "You really don't have to do this. We'll be fine." He smiled faintly. "I know," he said, "but I want to." The woman lowered her gaze, her throat tightening. "It's just. People don't usually, people should." He interrupted gently, his voice low and sincere. "And maybe they would if someone showed them how." Again, for a moment, she said nothing. There was something in his tone, a quiet ache, as if his kindness came from a place that had once known pain too. The little girl leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. "Can I ask something?" she said, her voice a mix of shyness and curiosity. He nodded, "Of course." "Why did you stop us?" she asked. "You don't even know us." The man chuckled softly, the sound warm and genuine. "You looked like you needed a friend," he said, "and I guess I did too." Before the woman could respond, the waitress returned, balancing a large tray. The rich aroma of pancakes, scrambled eggs, and warm syrup filled the air. Two plates were set gently before the mother and daughter, and a smaller one in front of the man, a quiet symbol that they were all sharing this meal together. The little girl's eyes widened, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. She looked up at her mother, who nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Go ahead, baby," she whispered. The girl didn't wait another second. She picked up her fork and began to eat small, careful bites at first, as if she was afraid the food might disappear. But soon she was smiling, her cheeks full, her eyes bright. The man watched, the corners of his mouth lifting. He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd seen something that pure, a child eating not out of habit, but joy. The mother, still hesitant, finally picked up her fork. The first bite hit her like a wave, not just food, but relief, warmth, gratitude. She closed her eyes briefly, swallowing hard. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "You don't know what this means." The man took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze soft. "Actually," he said, "I think I do." The woman looked up, puzzled. He smiled faintly, looking down at his plate. "There was a time when I didn't have much either. My mom used to take me to places like this when she couldn't afford dinner at home. We'd share a cup of coffee, just like you two, and one night, someone bought us a meal, just like this." He paused, his voice quieter now. "I never forgot that night. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd return it. Maybe not to the same people, but to someone who needed it the same way." The woman blinked rapidly, trying to hold back her tears. The little girl, listening closely, whispered softly, "So you're our angel tonight." The man chuckled, the sound breaking the heaviness of the air. "Maybe just a guy who believes in good things," he said. "And in people like you." The diner had grown even quieter now, as if the world outside had faded away. Snowflakes danced lazily past the window, glowing under the streetlight. The waitress wiped her eyes behind the counter, pretending to polish a glass. When they were done, the little girl leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "That was the best dinner ever," she said earnestly, "even better than birthdays." Her mother smiled, her heart full for the first time in a long while. "Say thank you, honey." The girl turned to the man. "Thank you, mister." He grinned. "You're very welcome." She hesitated, then asked, "Will we see you again?" He thought for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe someday. But even if we don't, you remember this: when you see someone who needs help, you help them. That's how this keeps going, okay?" The girl nodded solemnly, as if she'd been given a great secret. When they finally stood to leave, the man quietly slipped a few bills under the edge of their plate, enough for their meal and a little extra for the road. The woman noticed and shook her head, but he simply winked. "Don't argue," he said softly, "it's already done." At the door, the little girl turned back one last time. She waved, her smile bright and innocent. The man lifted his hand in return, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. As the door closed behind them and the cold night air swept briefly inside, the man exhaled, looking at the now empty booth. The plates still carried the warmth of what had just happened, a small act of compassion that had turned an ordinary night into something quietly sacred. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, one man sat alone again, but this time he didn't feel lonely. Somewhere out there, a mother and her little girl were walking through the cold with full hearts and full bellies because a stranger had seen them, truly seen them, and chose kindness instead of silence.